Tara Stone with Stone Building Solutions, and today we're excited to have our guest on our webinar. We're going to be doing this monthly, so please make sure that you're following us on YouTube so you can see everything that's happening in the condo world. Our two guests I've worked with them over the years, and I can tell you they know their stuff. We have Shayla Mount. She is an attorney at Arias Bosinger. She's been practicing for over a decade. She works for and helps the Florida board when it comes to real estate and trustees, and so specifically condominium associations. Her specialty is CA law. And then we have John Cadden. And John Cadden, like Steve Madden, so we can get it right, is with Condo Advisory Group. And John has had an interesting career. I've met John actually recently, and his background is very diverse, but he started in the conversion when it was in the apartment market, when we were converting apartments to condominiums. And now we're seeing this change where here we are 20 years later and people are deconverting back. So he likes to use the word a deconversion instead of a dissolution. It's a little bit softer, but this is difficult situations that we're talking about today, but they're not necessarily all bad. I was surprised to hear that myself. I've seen condos go through a dissolution process and it actually worked out quite well for the owners. So we need to discover if it's an option, if it makes sense, and exactly how does it work. Shayla, you want to say hi and introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Thanks, Tara. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. As Tara mentioned, I am an attorney in Winter Park, which is right outside of Orlando, specializing in community association law. We are general counsel to our condominium and homeowner association boards, and very excited to join John and Tara today to help our boards figure out how to weather the storm that is approaching, or in some instances has already arrived, in terms of the financial issues and whatnot facing our association. So happy to be here. Thanks.
John?
Good morning. Thank you, Tara and Shayla, and welcome everyone. And hoping we can have a lively discussion and learn a lot more about options that are available to condominium communities that may be facing some struggles these days, given all the things hitting them, from insurance to reserves and all the things that have started occurring this past year.
So if you guys don't know me, my name is Tara Stone. I'm the CEO of Stone Building Solutions. People call me the Tower of Tara because I'm really tall when I'm not on the Zoom camera. Our background, we started in property damage claims, but we have expanded. We're a full service engineering firm. We specialize in the condominium space. We also do reserve studies, structural integrity reserve studies, regular reserve studies, valuation appraisals, wind mitigation reports, balcony inspections, RFPs, and construction monitoring. So we are where you don't make 5 calls, make 1, and your complete reporting resource. So let's kind of talk about why we're here, right? We have Surfside that happened, the tragedy at the Champlain Towers, and how that has just affected everybody down to the last unit owner in Florida. We had a situation where years before the collapse, the president warned that there was going to be increased reserves. We have this squeezing of the orange where we weren't paying for things as we used them, right? We just kept juicing it, and there is no juice left. Ultimately, we have to make a change or a shift where we need to start paying for items that we use as we use them. The hard part is that many of the people in condominiums today weren't there when the things were getting used. They weren't there 20 years ago, and they weren't there 10 years ago. And now all of a sudden they're here in their condo, and they bought the condo with a certain budget, And the government and the banks and the insurance company are saying, you have to catch up. And the bottom line is there's no getting around it. Fannie Mae has issued a blacklist. We always knew that the blacklist existed before, but now they're saying, okay, we're going to make it public and we're going to constantly add condominiums that are quote unquote unfinanceable. So what happens is when you have a condominium that doesn't meet the reserve requirements or doesn't meet the law requirements that they need, is institutions do not want to lend. So banks will not lend money. Then instead of being able to open on the market, you're only open to cash buyers and investors. And we saw this, and John can probably allude to what happened back in the condo crash in the past. When units are not financeable, they lose their value and it goes down to pennies on the dollar. John, do you want to talk a little bit about what we saw happen before and how that relates to where we are today?
Well, it's a great question, Tara. And the reality is that leading up to 2008, we had a large amount of condominium developments, both ground up and conversion. And when the crash hit and values fell, a lot of people lost their units. They went into foreclosure and then they got recycled through the system, sold to people, both homeowners or investors. But through that process, what got lost in the translation is that boards were more interested in keeping their dues down than they were letting costs rise. And the first thing that people went after was the reserves. You were allowed to waive them under Florida law, and you were going to your membership and asking for a waiver of reserves or to pay more. And people were coming out of a financial crisis where they were having trouble collecting. There was dues that weren't being paid for units in foreclosure. And while that was sorting out, raising dues to those who were paying was making it harder. And it just became ingrained into the system that you didn't reserve as much money as you were recommended to by a reserve study that you were recommended to get. And it just snowballed from there to where years and years later, we just have a ton of deferred maintenance projects that haven't been done. And now we have our new statutes, which are making it impossible to waive reserves, and you have to take care of your community now.
Yeah, it's crazy how history repeats itself, but this time we can have a vision. And that's what this webinar is about, is saying, let's not ever let it get to the point where people have to go into foreclosure and that they have to be kicked out of their homes. Through education and knowing that dissolving the condo may be a way. It's obviously listen, my business is condos. So if you dissolve your condo, it's not good for me. Like, we want to be able to help you and we want to be able to help. And it's not good for Shayla because obviously you lose the condo, you lose the client. But our duty and our obligation at Stone is to help aging communities become fiscally and structurally sound and to help communities through this difficult time. So that means arming yourself with this education to know if it's a possibility or not. And you don't have to walk away with nothing. You can actually walk away with, I've seen cases where people walk away with more than they would get on the open market.
Well, and look, to your point, the goal isn't to walk in the door and say, let's terminate now. The goal is to go through every single option available and try to solve the problems. And that's what you need. You need cooperation of the board's counsel, their management company. And where you start is you try to isolate every issue, see if there is a reasonable and pragmatic way to solve it. And then if you really go through everything and do your diligence properly, and there are no other options, then you have this option of deconverting, and in the statute, it's called terminating, which sounds very, very draconian. But the reality is it can be a good option when you don't have other options. And we always go in starting with that's the last resort. It's sort of like bankruptcy. If you've ever heard a commercial bankruptcy attorney, they will tell you that the clients you don't know about are the ones that they had the most successful outcomes. And the ones that make the newspaper, the companies that have to go bankrupt a very public way, that was a last resort. It wasn't their first choice.
So what are we fighting? Like, we're fighting not necessarily the legislation. And I think that a lot of the anger turns to say, wait, why did these senators, why are they making us do this? Why are they making it fund all of a sudden? Why is insurance companies and banks forcing us to do this? And that's really the wrong enemy. So we really need to kind of isolate what the problem is and who the opponent is on the other side. The number one opponent is that old world way of condo thinking, where we're not going to reserve, we're going to buy, we're going to use now and pay later, because we've come to later, and later is not good. Now you look at the milestone inspections, those have been happening down in Miami-Dade since the 70s. And in the 70s, there was a DEA building in 1974. In the middle of the summer, it collapsed, the roof came down, and it killed 5 people and injured 15. And that building happened to be 40 years old. And at that time, that's when they came up with the 40-year recertification and said, okay, buildings call down at 40 years. If you talk to our engineers, what they'll tell you is a building without any maintenance, if you build something and just let it sit out in the middle of the forest, it will last 50 years and then it's done. Buildings require maintenance that requires funds for reserve. So we have to get away from that old world way of thinking so that we actually move into where we're paying, where we're using it. The second and most difficult enemy that we're fighting here is time. Because now that we change even if we change our mind shift, all of a sudden we have to catch up with the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years overnight, and we need time to replenish. So that's really where this becomes an option where it might not otherwise, is because we have that time crunch. And then the biggest thing that we're fighting is lack of involvement. Shayla, do you want to talk about what you see in terms of how many people show up at board meetings and the lack of general understanding from the community as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tara. And to put a finer point on the old world way of thinking and, budgeting requirements, what's the board doing? What's the board not doing? To be clear, it has always been a requirement of statute for the association to adopt a fully funded budget, right? So that includes the operating budget and reserves. And what you now have is a change in the ability of the owners to waive those reserve funding requirements, in addition to additional reserve components that now have to be reserved for per the CSRS requirements. And, it's not so much that the board has not been doing what it's been required to do. It's a function of the owners, again, taking that out. Now you don't have that opportunity. Another thing, and I know that we'll talk about this a little bit later, is owners have always had the opportunity to adopt or propose a amended budget under certain circumstances. That has generally not occurred until now. Now that the reserves must be funded, and now that the association has to specially assess to catch up for reserves that were not funded, now you have folks showing up to the board meetings that have always happened, the budget meetings that have always been noticed. Now that the budget is exploding, now the assumption is that it's a problem, and it's not a problem of the board whose hands are often tied. It's a problem of the circumstance. And, unfortunately, it turns into an adversarial situation a lot of times between the board and the owners, but it doesn't have to be.
You want to give the legal definition of what is a condo dissolution?
Sure. So a condominium dissolution occurs when the owners of the condominium association vote to officially terminate the condominium form of ownership of the condominium property. So to step back at a high level, a condominium building is created when the declaration of condominium is recorded in the official records of the county. And that condominium declaration includes a designation of individual units, as well as common elements that are owned in common among the individual unit owners. When we're talking about a condominium termination, as John mentioned earlier, you have the owners of the condominium in an optional termination voting to approve a plan to now terminate the ownership of the individual units and the common elements, and essentially turn the property back into one that is owned in fee simple, and usually so to a developer to maintain and own the condominium property.
You alluded to this earlier. Can you go through what questions the board needs to answer before they can even possibly consider if this would even be an option?
Are you on mute for a second? We didn't hear the whole question. I'm sorry.
Can you go ahead and go over this slide to go and talk about what questions the board needs to answer before they can even begin to think of condo dissolution as even a possible option on the table?
Yeah, I mean, look, the first thing that a board has to do is they have to look at everything in totality and break it down by the components. And the main component is it starts with the budget. And normal inflationary costs aside, we have this insurance issue. They have to then look at all their deferred maintenance projects, what they would have to spend if they were to do all those things. And now with the advent of the SERS report under the new statute and the milestone reports for some buildings, depending on their age, when theirs is due. But when they get that reserve study, the condition of the building is going to be a big important part of that. If you have a building that's been putting off projects or has even code violations already that need to be addressed, all of a sudden, and most of the properties don't have large reserves, you just look at those couple items and realize that your assessments are potentially doubling or even more, or you have to do a large special assessment. So you have to look and see, is it viable to fund those things, and what is the effect on all of the owners? And this gets back to what you said about boards, budgets, participation. We see anemic attendance at board meetings, and people usually don't come unless they have a single issue that they want to bring up. So you have 300 and 400 member unit association, and take away the board that has to come. There are maybe, you get 10 more people to a meeting. That's a lot. Typically it's 4 or 5 other people show up. Now, when you have a budget meeting or you are raising your assessments, you'll have a lot of people show up. So getting back to how you make that assessment, it has to be a situation where you come to grips with the fact that it's not financially viable for your ownership and the value of your property to be in a situation where your dues are so high, you're never going to be able to sell the unit to a third party who's not going to be able to get financing, or who's owning it as an investment. They're not going to be able to make money. And so values are going to start plummeting. And those are the situations where you want to start looking and say, do we have an option that's financially viable for us? It could be borrowing money, but that might, you have to look at what that effect is. And again, I get back to the fact is, when you've exhausted all those options properly, face them, that's when you're going to look at termination and try to figure out if you can do better for all your owners than the current market and sell it to a third party, be that, and most properties are going to end up converting back into rentals if they were initially. In rare circumstances, there are land parcels that are in such a location that they are worth a lot more if the building is completely scraped. But that's not the majority of condos. And again, you said something earlier, which is really important. People are paying for the sins of the past, and there's anger. So aside from all these facts, there's the whole issue of how do you deal with people who be they homeowners or investors who are just angry? Well, their first target is the board. The second target is the management company, and then it's the law firm who's representing them. And they just automatically go to someone must have done something wrong.
So that leads us to our next slide here. It's talking about the budget. And Shayla alluded to this earlier, and I think it's very important to talk about the board has a fiduciary responsibility to fund the necessary repairs. So regardless if there is a structural integrity reserve study or there isn't a reserve study, that when you are on the board, that is your responsibility for the community. So some of the changes in the laws are not just for 3-story or more, but for all condominiums and the ways that they can waive reserves. Prior, you were able to waive reserves with the majority of the people that showed up at the meeting, like the pictures that we talked about. There wasn't that many people there. Now it requires the majority of the membership. And why is that? Is because they're trying to increase participation and awareness and to say, hey, what's going on with my community? Shayla, when we were doing our prep call on this, you talked a little bit about some of those angers and some of the mudslinging that you see. Can you talk a little bit about, in your experience, what's happened with some of your clients when they don't have budgets that are able to be funded?
Yeah, so again, going back as a general matter, the board has the unilateral authority by a vote of the board and the obligation to adopt a fully funded budget. It generally does not require ownership approval. It does require notice. So, it's, oftentimes you'll get, well, I never knew that the budget was this, or, well, how did we realize that the budget had not been funded, fully funded, or the reserves had not been funded for the past 10 years? Where was the notice? Well, there is a 14-day notice. But as John said, owners rarely ever show up unless there is that increase. And now you're getting to the increase, right? And when it comes to special assessments, particularly, again, the board generally, after 14-day notice, has the authority to adopt a special assessment in any amount. Now, there may be some provisions in the condominium's governing documents that may place threshold restrictions on the amount a special assessment can be without obtaining unit owner approval. But if there's nothing in the bylaws or the declaration that requires owner approval, then the special assessment can be adopted by the board in any amount. And what we've been seeing, and this is even before we're getting to the milestone inspection in the SIRS, what we're seeing now are special assessments just to fund insurance premiums. And that special assessment on the insurance premium alone, can be $4,000, $5,000 a unit. And that's certainly not a function of mismanagement of prior boards or even the current board. That's a function of just the market and the fact that there is no private market for insurance for condominiums. But the point is that also when we're talking about reserves and budgeting, insurance and obtaining and maintaining a minimum level of insurance on the condominium is also a requirement of the board, a statutory requirement of the board to maintain this. And the board's hands are tied. if you can't get, if in the first instance, you have to specially assess, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And you have to do what you have to do. But if there's a situation where the governing documents actually limit the special assessment that the board can impose, then your hands are really tied, because you don't have the ability to assess the members, and you either have to seek alternative funding. Again, you need to look in your governing documents to see if loans are an option. But who wants to obtain loans just to operate the condominium with insurance when you have these repairs coming down the line? So it's an unfortunate situation for these boards who now are again playing the bad cop. When we look at the SIRS and the milestone requirements, they're actually in the statute. It says that for boards that willfully and knowingly fail to complete the milestone inspection or fund the SIRS, that is a breach of that director or officer's fiduciary duty. That is now written into the statute. So again, you're going to have owners who are looking to that to say, board, you haven't done your due, but their hands are tied in a lot of ways.
And it really goes down to every single piece of it, because when I was just at CAI Nationals in Dallas last spring, you already had insurance companies that just offer directors and officers policies, even getting nervous about offering them in Florida and wanting to increase premiums, because now they're seeing, okay, there's additional fiduciary responsibilities that are becoming big issues. We don't even know if we want to insure for them there. And bottom line is, I know nobody wants to be the bad guy, and that was the problem before, right? Even if you were the board and you wanted to do the right thing and you wanted to fully fund reserves, it was difficult because you couldn't go walk your dog or get your mail with everybody yelling at you. Because if you had the option to keep the money down or raise it, I mean, who's going to say, oh, no, I want to pay more? So that's what happens is insurance companies now, when you get your yearly renewal, you're going to see that they're going to want to see copies of not only structural integrity reserve studies, but regular reserve studies. They're going to want to see the reports that we provide for the milestone and for envelope inspections. And when units are bought and sold, banks are requiring this because banks understand, they know that a unit owner can afford a $500,000 note, but they know that they can't afford a $100,000 assessment. So the laws require it, the banks require it, the insurance companies require it, so we have no choice but to move forward. John, you want to talk about the sum being worth more than the parts? And I always love the story of the redwood trees in California, because when you go there, they're so magnificent. And you're like, how do these trees grow for so long and not burn down? And the reason they don't get burned, if people don't know this, is because their roots are all connected at the bottom. So when a windstorm comes, that's the reason they can stay standing, because they're supporting each other. And when a fire comes, they can actually take the water and protect it from all the root system and help regrow. And that's why you don't see redwoods completely burned down. So it's a community, right? And when we go and we're talking about dissolution, truly being a community, what you bought into when you bought into a condo can be the thing that actually is the saving grace. Actually coming together as a community is like a fire. When all these bad things are happening, that can be the one thing that saves an association. So can you say, from a broker perspective, and to be clear, John is not a broker. He does not buy the communities. He's not really acting like a real estate agent. We'll have him explain a little more about specifically what he does. But can you talk about the value of the forest?
Yes. Well, look, the most ideal situation is when you have a community where there is a potential buyer for the property that will pay a price that's higher than what you can get by listing your unit on its own. And in many cases, and we talked about this the other day, while there are a lot of home ownership in condo communities in Florida, there is a huge investment community. that is invested in condos for years and years and years and use them for rentals, and where they can get away with it, where they're not prevented, they'll use them as Airbnbs. But there's a big investor community here as well. And what I think we're looking at is the operation of a condominium that has home ownership and rental in it was not what condominiums were originally slated to be. They were supposed to be your homes in a community setting. And it worked well for a long time, and it can still work well. But in the cases where the dysfunction has caused all these financial issues and things have been put off for so long, if you look at each property individually and you assess properly what it would look like if it was sold to one buyer, and that is greater than the market value, it's a win-win for the community. We can't say that every community is going to be in that situation, but the ones that are in that situation have a better chance of getting through the process of terminating and doing it properly than the ones that are facing huge financial issues and the values lower. And that's, not everybody's going to be savable, as we know, and that's sad but true. But in most cases, especially properties with a lot of rentals in them, it's an inefficient way to operate a rental with several different landlords. And when one landlord has the entire rental property themselves, it's a different standard. We always like to say, look, if you have a 300 unit property and you have 30 or 40 homeowners and you have 260 investors, and there's some bulk owners in there, but you might have 200 landlords. That's not efficient. There's no standards to the interiors. Some people rent their units for less, some for more. So there's chaos. And it's chaos for the community, because you're trying to enforce rental standards and keep a community in a manner that everybody knows what it is. And you really struggle with that. Management companies struggle with that many. It's hard enough to deal with 300 owners. Now you got to deal with their managers and different things. So when we get back to the sum of the parts, it is typical that the sum of the parts will be worth more than the individual units on the market.
Yeah, and it also depends, like if everyone goes and sells, the person that sells first probably gets the most, but what happens when half of the market, half of the units get sold, and then the word's out, and then there's no financing, then the other half of them kind of really get hosed, right? So that's why coming together is what's paid fairly. And we're going to talk as we move on about valuations. But let's first talk, if you're considering doing condo dissolution, what are the rules in play that you would use? There's two different kinds of rules, Kaufman language and document specific. Shayla, since this is a legal term, you want to take this?
Sure. And just to kind of at a high level, kind of discuss what we're talking about when we're talking about condominium governance. So for those who may or may not know, in Florida, condominiums are creatures of statute, and that specific statute is Chapter 718 of the Florida statutes. 718.117 is the specific provision of the Condominium Act that has been amended over time to specifically allow and to authorize, as a statutory matter, the termination of condominiums. I mentioned that condominiums are created when the declaration of condominium is recorded in the county where the condominium building is. Generally, in that declaration, in that original declaration, there's also going to be provisions that speak to termination of the condominium. And so when we're, one of the first things we need to do when we're advising condominium associations about whether or not condominium termination is an option is we have to review both the governing documents and the statutory provisions of 718.117 to determine what's actually there. There are two types, general types of termination. One dealing with impossibility and economic waste. And that's based on, formula and is generally hard to do. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But when we're talking about optional termination, which is the more general, which is generally what we see more often, that is a termination by a vote of the owners, 80% of the owners to agree to the plan to terminate. What Tara was alluding to when we talk about Kaufman language, the statutory ability and the procedures in the Condominium Act related to termination have been changed over time. One significant change in the statute as it relates to optional terminations is the minimum percentage of owners that are allowed to reject the condominium termination plan. And so when we talk about Kaufman language, just generally, Kaufman language comes from the case Kaufman v. Scheer, and it essentially stands for the premise that the condominium and interpretation of an application of the condominium provisions as it relates to the statute, whatever statute was in place at the time that the condominium declaration was recorded applies. And so a lot of these older condominiums, the declaration was recorded before a lot of these changes in the Condominium Act statute. And so we have to first determine whether or not there's Kaufman language in the declaration that automatically incorporates the changes in the statute. If there's not that Kaufman language, then that may be a conversation with the association to consider amending the documents or to figure out, what actual threshold applies depending on, again, what's in your documents versus what's in the statute.
So let me break this down really simple for everyone. So most of the older documents don't have Kaufman language. It's almost impossible to do a condo termination with this old archaic documents because there's so many different ways to get out of it that no person or company or entity is going to go through this long, arduous process when it's ultimately just could be thrown out the door. So
and to be more specific, a lot of these older provisions for termination requires 100% unanimous consent of the owners and may also require the written consent of first mortgage holders or lien holders.
It will never, ever happen, right? Exactly. So it's almost impossible. So there is language in the statute that says how to do this. It requires 80% vote of all the membership with less than 5% of people saying, no, we don't want to do this. So that is difficult in and of itself, getting 80 people to agree on something. So that's why the first step going through this process is amending the documents to include the Kaufman language so you can use the statutory provisions of the 80% with less than 5%. So I asked John, okay, John, if we know that we're amending these documents, do you tell people that you're amending them, why you're amending them? Or do you first just amend the documents and then start talking about condo dissolution? And what was your answer, John?
Well, my answer was you have to be totally transparent. You have to be honest. And you can't just send something out to people and say, vote for this, if you don't explain what you're doing. And basically, you have to put in the new language in the announcement, and you should be educating people as to why you're doing it. One of the things that you do when you amend these documents is you have to tell people why you're doing it. It doesn't mean you're going to terminate. It means you're updating it so that you can do it in the way that's the most viable for your community. One of the things that I think is important is go back a little in history is after the crash, you had so many communities that were being attempted to be taken over by bulk owners. They were attempting to terminate the condos using the old language. And they decided to come up with a system that was a little harder. And it actually does make it, as you said, you have to, under the new language, and Shayla, correct me if I'm wrong, but every condominium since that was passed, when you do a new condominium, you're using this new language. The old language was geared towards casualty. It was there in case your building burned down, the hurricane knocked you down. It wasn't a economic strategy. And then people started using it after the crash as a way to take a community over so they could turn it back to rental and own everything. The reason that, and it occurred in some cases, mostly when not a lot of the units were sold. And in the end, they made this language tougher. So you're going back to people and actually telling them your language that you have, if it says you need 75%, or even if you need 80% of the people, it's still giving 5% of your community a chance to object to the plan. So you're also agreeing to do something that may be harder in theory than your existing documents. So you're protecting all the homeowners even more. So back to your first question is, you go at it openly, transparent, and that gets back into the whole process. People, when people are going out and buying up units so that they can get it to a threshold level to terminate, they're buying units from individual owners. They're buying them at whatever prices they can get them at. And the owners that haven't sold yet have no idea who's getting what. When you do it through a plan, there are just requirements of transparency throughout the whole termination process. And it really gets rid of a lot of fear that people feel they're getting taken advantage of because the guy across the hall is getting more money, or the guy with the same units getting more money, or I don't know if he is. So everything about beginning with the amenity documents through the whole process, if that's the road a community is going down, is about transparency, as you say on the slide. And again, amending the documents. Well, if you can't get the documents amended, the chances of you being able to go forward with a termination are pretty much done. So you don't just spring this on people. It's a process that starts with discussion and education and participation.
Absolutely. And it's the test. So here we go. If you can't get the amended, this is the bottom line. If you cannot get the documents amended, the votes for that to even use the Kaufman language, you're never going to go through a termination plan. So this is the first step in introducing the idea to the community. It doesn't mean you're going to do it or you're even close to do it. It means that your community could go over that bridge if they decide to down the line. So I would highly suggest, if anybody watching this webinar and they think that, oh, when we might not be able to fund, start working on this process now, because it's good language to have. You should have it regardless. So I'm going to talk about the next slide, which is, how is the value decided? Because that's what people care about. How long does it take, and how much does it cost, and how much am I going to get? At Stone Building Solutions, we also do insurance valuation appraisals, meaning we put values on buildings. We do that for insurance companies, but we also can help with items like this. So there's three ways that you can actually do it. The first is by percentage of ownership interest. The second is the market value by the county appraiser, which you know that number is very relatively low. Appraisal per unit style, which is probably the most kind of accurate way to gauge. And then an alternative method, which can be a combination of 1, 2, or 3 of those. So typically what happens is you say, okay, we have 6 different unit styles, and then we can, in the part of the plan, and something that John's company does, Condominium Advisory Group, is help say, how do we make it fair for the person that has that same unit that hasn't renovated anything from 1976 to the person that just upgraded their kitchen or bathroom. So John, can you talk about the question is, what if I've upgraded? Because that's what I would be concerned about if I had a unit.
Right. Well, it's typical in a termination plan that you want to have some provision in there to compensate people for work done in a unit. And you got to put a time limit on it. So someone bought their unit in 2012 and they upgraded the whole thing. They're not really at the market of upgrading. But if someone did it, and it's a choice. This is totally what the community is about and what you feel may work. Typically within 5 years, it can be less. I don't think it really should be more, but again, those are decisions you have to make. And you want to go with the major items in there, say kitchens, bathrooms, flooring, the appliances and things, and they have to prove it. They have to come up with their invoices, and then you have to inspect the units. And they really have to have done those things. If you don't mind, I want to go back to the last slide for a second. When we talk about the alternative method, it's by agreement. So if the association votes on a plan to say this is what everybody gets and it passes, then that's what we'll get. The market value by county appraisal that's not what you're getting for your property. This is how you're splitting your proceeds. So actually, what we've found is the market value by county appraisal, which is done for taxing purposes, is actually a really good method. What you're really doing is you're using that number and adding up the sum of all the market values of each unit, and then you're dividing that unit by the total, and that becomes the percentage of the proceeds they get from the sale. And it's actually more accurate. Percentage of ownership interest is only really good when you have one unit style, because it's done by square footage, and that's how you divide up your costs in the community to pay your assessments and whatnot, and your special assessments. However, percentage of when you look at condominiums and homes as well, historically, is the smaller the unit, the higher per square foot price they get, and as the units get bigger, the per square feet price goes down. So you're punishing smaller units by using percentage of ownership when you're dividing up the spoils of a sale price, and the people that own the bigger units are actually getting an extremely kind of ballooned value. So using the market value by county appraisal is actually a really good value, and appraisal per unit style works as well. But the difference is, if you pick one appraiser and they do 6 styles, you might not necessarily get the most accurate appraisals. There might be factors. And if you pick 3 appraisers, and then it's going to cost the association more money to get these done going through it, appraisals can be very subjective. So we like the market value by county appraisal approach. It just has turned out to be one that really is fair to everyone, and it has nothing to do with the value of that number. Those values are less than what you sell your unit for, but it's a value that's done for tax purposes, and it just seems to accurately reflect the difference in values on a per square foot basis, and then you back it into your formula and you come up with your percentages.
So how do you take into account if something overlooks the pool or it overlooks the ocean?
Well, again, when you get into that detail of views and whatnot, that's where things get tough. And that's why those deals are tougher to do, because someone who overlooks the ocean or overlooks the street feels their unit is worth more money. When you get into normal condominiums that don't have those issues, whether you face the pool or you face the golf course or you face the and wherever you face, those communities, just it's not as big an effect. So that's a tough one, Tara. And I know some of the people I've seen who are on this call that I know who've been involved in some of the oceanfront deals know that that's one of the biggest hurdles, is people don't feel that it's fair. But again, if you're talking about an oceanfront condo that was built in the 60s or the 70s and is facing a lot of issues, it's usually worth more for land value. And what all these owners don't realize is the guy who's buying it, or the gal who's buying it, or the company that's buying it is scraping the building. So they don't care which way your unit faces. You're getting a lot more money than your unit's worth. And the fact the guy across the hall is getting the same money because you both have a 2,000 square foot condo are you going to tank the whole deal over that? And that's part of the psychology of all this, is you're doing this because there's issues at your property and you have this opportunity to make more money and get out of it and avoid huge assessments and trouble and market values going down. So that's why a
That's what we
transparent.
have to remember is that it's not just the value of what you sell the unit for, but it's also the value of what you're not spending in special assessments
Right.
and cost. So that's where it comes to really this next piece. So the first thing you're doing is amending the documents. The second thing you're doing is coming up with a termination plan, and that termination plan does include the valuation of the unit. And the next thing, the most important part of what has to be done through a condo dissolution is the education. Because remember, we have to get that 80% vote with less than 5% objections. And that's not just going to come by holding one board meeting or sending out a flyer. It's really about educating the community, unit by unit, member by member, of what this means for them. John, you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the first thing to bring aboard is board members are volunteers and they give their time thanklessly. And they spend a lot more time than people realize dealing with day-to-day issues. And the management company too has the same issue. They're paid a fee to oversee the operations of the property. And to make sure things are running according to both the board's wishes, and hopefully those are good wishes, and according to the statutes and what their fiduciary responsibility is to their association they work for. But in order to get to all the people and to get them involved it takes, unfortunately, I don't say unfortunately, I think it's fortunately, you have to speak to almost every single owner and let them have their chance in a setting that isn't at a meeting in a room full of people to be educated. And that's not something that management companies, the board, and frankly, the law firm doesn't have the time to do, and people aren't paid to do that. And that's sort of been our modus operandi when we're hired by a association, is we're doing all the work. And because of our background in the old days of converting, we're using the same strategies that we use to convert properties to deconvert them. And it's a marketing process. And you are not walking into a meeting and holding a vote, because under the law, statute, if you have a vote at a meeting and you don't get the 80% at that meeting, you're done. You've exhausted your ability to terminate. So before you get to that point, you're gonna collect votes. You're gonna do it differently, and you're not going to hold a meeting and lose the vote at the meeting. And I just saw a comment from Dennis Casa, which said, his board was told by their law firm to be neutral. Well, that is, his situation was someone was trying to buy the whole thing and to buy all the units, and there was not a termination plan in place, and therefore the board was probably better to remain neutral. But with the termination plan, there is no neutrality necessary. It's a plan. It's out to everyone. It's transparent. So that's just another reason why doing it through an official plan, as opposed to letting someone come in and try to buy up all the units individually and then take over the condominium and take over the board. It just all leads into this whole transparency situation that makes it possible to do it. And
let's talk about the vote. You actually go around unit by unit and you get those votes notarized, correct?
well, you have to have a signed notarized document agreeing to the plan by the folks that are agreeing to it. And that's just another thing that is, people don't have their friendly neighborhood notary nearby. So there's a lot of things you have to do to help people get there, get the documents done. In the old phrase, it's like herding cats. It's not easy. And remember, in Florida, probably more than any other state. I don't want to say California and Texas may, or Arizona may have more, but I think Florida has the largest percentage of condominium ownership from foreign nationals of any state I've ever seen. And that's just a whole nother layer of issues that you have to face when trying to get these votes done.
So what happens? So let's back up here. Okay, first thing we do, we're changing and putting in the Kaufman language, right? The second thing we're doing, we're coming up with a termination plan that includes values. The third thing we're doing is educating. And no one laughed. Look at all these pictures of John. I found old bald men for the slide here. Huh. And the third thing we're doing is educating. The fourth thing we're doing is going out and collecting the votes to see if we can get to that 80%. But let's talk about if you're someone that doesn't absolutely want the termination plan to go through. Tell us about the block. The block can be termination if it's blocked by 5% of the community. Anyone that, so you want to talk about this, John?
Sure. I mean, again, let's just talk numbers. If you have a 200 unit community, you can not have more than 10 people object to the plan. And that is a really low number of people, and it could be daunting. So when you're faced with all the other things and they're legitimately been vetted out, you're really looking at someone who wants to bring the ship down, or doesn't know what's going on and just doesn't want to do it. You know, the future, you never, what do they say in the brokerage world? You know, past results are not indicative of future results. But we have found that there is less objection once you do things in a transparent way. And sometimes the people that were the original, I don't want to sell, turn out to be your biggest allies. I don't know if that's always going to remain that way, but we go into it believing that we can achieve it because we have the facts on our side. Look, if it's a property that has millions of dollars of deferred maintenance, and especially now you're being told you have to do it, you have to reserve for it, you've gotten all your studies and you've had experts go through, and people start looking at especially what it's going to cost for them to live there, or just living in a community where they're faced with this turmoil all the time and it's hanging over their head. Even people that live there, not just investors, that it's almost like freedom to get out from underneath this horrible cloud that hangs over their heads. And I think Shayla knows this as well, that it's not a good feeling, and boards aren't in a good position either. And a lot of board members resign and they just walk away. Elections for boards generally don't even get enough candidates, and so whoever volunteers gets the job. But and then you have board members who do everything they can. They'll go shopping for contractors, they'll go shopping for engineers, they'll go shopping for reserve study, someone who will tell them what they want to hear to get away from all this. So the cloud that's hanging over a community that is just facing all these issues is, you know, you don't want to sound like you're being a grave dancer, but some of these places are dead and they don't know it yet. And then here we are saying to them, we have a solution, and it's a good one. It's not good for everybody who may have to find a new home or an investor who can't find another property, but it's better than losing money and losing value and not being able to afford to live there or hold on to your unit as an investment because now the rent's not covering all your costs. So this block is real, and it's just something you have to deal with. And there are communities where you're not going to even get to a termination because you know before you get there, and that's part of our analysis, and we can talk for hours about that. And one of the things when we're through with this, if he's still on, and there's someone I know very well who had gotten into this call, and when we have a chance for opening the floor, if we can, or in the chat, this is an attorney who, when I first talked to him a year ago about going down this road, as opposed to the old road, which was buying everyone out and taking control and terminating later. We butted heads, and now we're on the same page. So I think the world's coming around to it isn't easy to terminate no matter how you do it, but there's a better way now.
And this is what's important to understand. If it's blocked at the 5%, it's not like, okay, we're just going to try again next month. It is an 18 to 24 month stop on the entire termination plan. That means everything shuts down. But what doesn't shut down is the bills and the requirement. The insurance requirements are still there. The budgetary requirements are still there. The banking requirements are still there. The building is still aging. And as we know, the cost of corrective maintenance is 300 times the amount of preventative maintenance. So the bills are stacking up. So you would never want to even go to that 80% vote without knowing that you wouldn't get the block. So I want to talk about timeline, and we can never give a full timeline of exactly how long it's going to take, but we can give you the best case scenario. And, you know, it just gets longer from there. So if we start, let's say we watch this webinar today and we realize funding issues arise. So we need to find professional help, initial discussion and analysis. And this is still a really short time, right? Because if you haven't done a reserve study, or you haven't had an engineer come look at the building or a contractor look at the building, and you have no idea about cost, you might be in this first 30 days for a very long time. You also might want to say, we want to explore the loan option. Can we get a loan? How much does it cost? What does that look like in 2, 5, 10, and 15 years for the ownership and for the membership? So you can say, does this even make sense? So starting on this first step of the process is where a lot of associations are if you're watching this webinar, and it's really important that you move through that process. And you can call Stone Building Solutions if you need a reserve study, if you need a structural integrity reserve study, or if you need an engineering analysis. After you do that, and we say, okay, we think we're going to move forward with a termination plan, the best case scenario is 30 days to amend the documents, right? Because we know we have to get that Kaufman language in there. So you have to have board meetings, you have to give notice, you have to talk to your attorney and do all those things. So now we've gone and we've decided it's the right thing. We've amended the documents. Now education. John can't go talking to all of the unit owners. But there's 15 unit owners, that might be pretty quick. But if you have an association that has 400 unit owners, it's going to take some time to do that education. Now you have to collect 80% of the notarized membership votes approving the plan. We talked about, we have overseas owners, we have people that are away, we have people that are difficult to reach. So we know that it's going to take several months to go through that process of collecting the vote. And then once the vote is actually collected and we say we've got it approved, there is a 20-day waiting period. So that's the period, 20 days after you get to that 80%, where you can get written objection and we can do that block that you talked about. So you have 80 days right there in that process. Then you go ahead and submit the termination plan to the Division of Condominiums. And that's going to take anywhere from 2 weeks to a month and a half, depending on where they are in the system, to actually record it. And then once the termination plan is actually recorded, that's when you're going to go through the process with the buyer, because the buyer is not going to be able to put a value on it. They're not going to dance too much around the actual what that condo is going to buy and sell until they know it's actually been terminated. You don't have a true asset to sell until it becomes an asset. So typically, best case scenario is a 90-day close to go to secure the buyer and move to close. So as you can see, if you just add all this up, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You're looking at a year to go through this process if you start. Best case scenario, maybe 6 months, 9 months. Longest case scenario, 15 months. Because if you start to get in this process of the 80% or the education, and you know you're not going to get there, you're not going to continue. You're just going to stop. John or Shayla, did you have anything to add to that timeline?
Again, only just to say, in terms of the termination plan recording, the plan is recorded in the official records, and after it's recorded, it is submitted to the division. If you don't hear back from the division within that 45 days, it's deemed approved. But it may take longer if you actually do get revisions or additional requests from the division. Prior to 2017, optional termination plans did not require approval from the division. But after 2017, you now have the requirement of this additional requirement of the division approving the plan. So that may elongate the process even longer if there is additional input or information requested from the division. So it's always a lot of moving parts.
And by the way, that 90-day period after the plan has been approved by the division is a statutory issue. So it's not a matter of whether you're trying to find a buyer or not. You just can't close. There's some additional things that can occur during that time period. But it gets back to one of the most important things that Shayla just brought up is you want to make sure that your plan has been written, vetted, and done by an experienced termination attorney, and to make sure that they've got experience. And that's one of the things we bring to the table is we bring that counsel into the fray. We work with the association counsel as well so that everybody's on the same page and try to avoid that particular pitfall. I do want to say one other thing. There are termination plans where you can put a buyer in the plan, and that's another discussion as to where and when that's the best thing to do or why to do it. But sometimes you have an actual buyer who says, subject to you getting an approved termination, I'm going to be your buyer, and here's the price, and everyone knows what you're getting. You also put minimum pricing in the plan. So you can say the worst case is here's what you're going to get. If we get more, we all get more. But the important thing is also to note is when you get an approved termination plan, until there's a closing of that property, you're still operating every day as a condo. Nothing's changed for the owners. If someone wants to sell and doesn't want to wait around, they can do it. The association exists until the day of that closing. And so no one's rights are changed. Nothing happens. It's business as usual, hopefully better, until you get there. And that's a very important point that is part of the education process, is letting people know we're not done today. This isn't what's happening.
You're not going to be kicked out of your house tomorrow. And that's why that timeline is important for people to understand. It gives them options to sell if they don't want to be a part of it, and they can sell their unit during that time. Go ahead, sell your unit during that time. No one's kicking you out on the street and you have to leave. Typically, what happens to people that have units? Can they stay there? How does that work out, John?
Well, under the statute, the people who are actual homestead owners are granted the right to lease their unit at market rates for at least a year, minimum. So you don't have to leave. You can rent your unit, and then one of the things
that happens a lot.
At the end of the day, not as much as you'd think. A lower percentage, because during this time frame, people start to make plans, and that's a part of the sales process is accommodating those people where suddenly they don't really know what they're going to do, and then 3 weeks before the closing, they find their house and they don't want to lease. So the buyer has to understand that a little bit. Part of being a buyer of these properties is figuring out how to accommodate owners. And that's where things can get complicated or uncomplicated, depending. But most people really don't want to stay. It's just more timing for them. And then a lot of people who never thought they'd leave, just this whole process becomes an impetus for a life change. And they needed that little push over the edge on something they've been nervous. They've been in this community where they don't feel like they have a say, and their costs are going up, and it's starting to hurt them financially. But it's hard. Life changes are hard. So, and a lot of times there's a little reverse psychology here where people who have been reticent to leave are suddenly saying, well, now I have to. And then they start looking at the possibilities, and it doesn't happen all the time, but we've had some homeowners thank us afterwards saying this has been the best thing that's happened to me.
John, I think those are good stories to tell, and we want to educate, but I cannot let you off because without letting our audience know, how much does it cost? We know how long it takes. We know what it involves. Now we want to know, what are we looking at if we want to hire someone like your firm that does a termination consultant? Because we know we need attorneys and we have everything else. You can't give us an exact price, but can you give us a general?
Well, the way we try to portray it is if you were to go to market for your property and hire a real estate agent, which is the best way to get to the market, and pay 6%, and then you pay another 1% minimally of closing costs, maybe a little more depending on your situation at the property, that gets you about 7%. Now, there's a scale of economies because you have some fixed costs that are there. It costs the same to write a termination plan, whether you're 20 units or 2,000 units. Some of the reports and things that you need are fixed costs. So the bigger the property it is, the more that cost goes down per unit. But generally, we find that it stays below what it would cost you to sell as a single seller. But again, the bigger the property, the lower that percentage cost is going to be. And the fixed costs, the association, are the basic initial costs to do the plan and some and the mailings and some other and getting the notaries done. So the association is going to have to spend some money, but it's not a huge sum. They have to have some skin in the game, as we like to say. And our company, for the most part, is a contingency-based fee based on getting it closed. So we take a lot of risk to get it done for you. And that's why it's a good option as well, because you're not paying us if we don't achieve success.
All right, that's what we like to hear. Thank you for disclosing that pricing. Shayla, we're kind of up on an hour and 15 minutes here, so I want to wrap this up and then we'll open it up to questions. Do you have any final closing remarks?
Just that it's important for boards and owners to know that this is one of, again, the many potential options available. But, it's important that if this is a potential option, to start early. Again, the timeline that you shared requires, not just the legal and the work behind the scenes with, John's group and your general counsel. A lot of this is the public relations campaign, and that starts early, and it has to be effective. And it's just important for the board to wrap their heads around, what the options are, and to begin communicating that and percolating that amongst the directors as well as the membership.
Well, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, I'm Tara Stone with Stone Building Solutions. We offer full service engineering. If you are looking at your buildings and saying, all right, I don't really know what I need to do, like, what really do we have to spend? Can we afford it or not? We offer that full service. We'll come out, diagnose what's wrong, help you put a cost on what it is to do the repairs, and set the reserve funding so should I go through this dissolution process, or do we have an alternative means? There's many times where we can value engineer the repairs and stagger them in ways that you can afford it, and it does make sense to get a loan. So we're certainly not advocating that dissolution is the only solution, but it is one that's out there. We will now kind of open it up to questions to see what we have here. Valerie, is there any questions that we have that we think we need to answer? If anyone has, go ahead and put it in the chat. And if not, we will wrap up and you can contact any of us. And please join and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more information like this coming to you monthly from Stone Building Solutions. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day.